I knew the exact moment I became furniture. It was not when they moved my desk next to the server closet to make room for a custom-built ping-pong table. And it was not when the newly hired director of company culture asked me if I was the technician sent to fix the copy machine. It was at the grand dinner celebrating our Series C funding. They were popping expensive champagne like it was tap water, toasting to the visionary genius of Bradley Thorne, while Bradley himself stood on a mahogany table, soaking wet, shouting about how he had single-handedly changed the world. I was sitting at the far end of the table, nursing a lukewarm seltzer, watching them celebrate a complex system they did not even know how to boot up. People think technology startups are built on pure dreams and caffeine. They are not. They are built on stacks of legal paperwork that nobody reads because everyone is too busy measuring their own importance in the glass. Reflection of a high-rise office building. 8 years ago, before the sleek glass offices and the fleece vests, it was just me and a laptop in a rented basement that smelled like damp drywall and desperation. I wrote the core algorithm, the predictive commerce engine that currently generates 90% of this company's revenue. Bradley provided the cheap pizza and the marketing hype. I provided the actual logic. I am Roger Miller, and at 54 years old, I have learned that the quietest person in the room often holds the keys to the kingdom. Back when we were incorporating the business, Bradley was in a manic state, signing papers without looking, his eyes already fixed on imaginary billions. I was different. I was a researcher with trust issues and a mountain of student debt. I did not want equity that could be easily diluted by greedy venture capitalists. I wanted absolute control. So, in the thick stack of incorporation documents, tucked neatly between the boilerplate corporate bylaws and the standard non-compete clauses, I slipped in a single, boring sheet of paper. It was an intellectual property lease agreement. It stated in very plain English that I, Roger Miller, retained full and exclusive ownership of the predictive logic source code, version 1.0, and all its future derivatives. The agreement leased this code to NetVantage Incorporated for the nominal fee of $1 per year. The lease was renewable annually and was terminable by the licensor, which was me, with 30 days' notice if the annual lease fee was not paid or if the contract was not formally renewed. Bradley signed it with a flourish using an expensive pen he could not afford. He did not read it. Nobody read it. For 8 years, I paid myself that $1 out of the petty cash box, filed the physical receipt, and renewed the lease. I was the ghost in the machine. I kept the engine running, patched the security holes, and scaled the database architecture while Bradley went on podcasts and talked about synergy and disruption. But the corporate atmosphere shifted about 6 months ago. The company grew too large for its own good. The engineering culture went from charmingly chaotic to toxic and corporate. I stopped being the respected founding engineer and started becoming a legacy liability. I was not young. I did not play golf. I did not want to participate in trust exercises at corporate retreats in the desert. I just wanted to build clean, functional software. I sat there at that funding dinner, watching Bradley high-five the new vice president of sales, a young guy who looked like he was manufactured in a lab that specializes in teeth whitening and unearned confidence. A cold calm settled over me. They looked at me and saw an aging programmer in a simple cardigan who helped out in the early days. They did not realize they were looking at their landlord, and the rent was about to go up. The disconnect was almost funny. They were celebrating the harvest, completely unaware that I owned the tree, the soils, and the water rights. I went back to the office late that night, not to work, but to check the physical filing cabinet in the basement. There it was, yellowing slightly, the original lease agreement with Bradley's signature in blue ink. I made a high-resolution digital copy and a physical duplicate. Then I went home, poured a glass of whiskey, and waited for the inevitable storm to arrive. The storm arrived in the form of a new chief technology officer named Julian Kent, brought in by the board of directors because the company supposedly needed professional executive polish. Julian was the kind of manager who used words like ideate, North Star, and scalable synergy in casual conversation. He had an expensive business degree and a personal code repository that was a barren wasteland. He walked into the engineering department on his first day, clapped his hands, and announced that we were going to pivot to a modern architecture driven by fresh framework buzzwords. I felt a headache starting behind my eyes. The current system was already modern. I had built it that way. But managers like Julian do not look at the actual code. They only look at the marketing slides. Julian Kent called me into his office on Tuesday morning. It was one of those modern glass fishbowls where everyone in the building can see you getting demoted or fired. He did not offer me a chair. Instead, he sat on the edge of his desk, swinging his leg, trying to look casual and authoritative at the same time. He looked at me with a patronizing smile that immediately told me everything I needed to know. He was wearing a brand new pair of designer wool sneakers and a fleece vest that looked like it had never seen a day of real work. "Roger, hey, you have done some great work on the legacy systems here," he said, using that term like he was talking about an ancient relic from a bygone era. "But we are bringing in a new team of engineers to handle the build for NetVantage version 2.0. We need fresh eyes, younger energy, and developers who understand the modern landscape. You know how the industry is. We have to stay agile and disrupt our own products before competitors do." "I wrote the core predictive model, Julian," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "If you change the data ingestion pipeline without understanding the underlying math, you will break the predictive modeling. The historical customer databases will not map correctly, and the system will collapse. The latency will spike from 50 milliseconds to several seconds, which will ruin the customer experience." He waved his hand dismissively as if swatting away a persistent fly on a hot summer afternoon. "That is exactly why we need you to transition to a new advisory role. We want you to document everything, write down the tribal knowledge, hand over the administrative keys to the servers so the new engineering stars can take the wheel. We are creating a new title for you, Head of Legacy Maintenance. It is a vital role for the transition, and it shows the board that we respect our historical foundation while building the future. Head of Legacy Maintenance." It was corporate speak for the guy who cleans up the garbage. He wanted me to write the instruction manual for my own replacement, then sit quietly in a dark corner fixing minor bugs while he took all the credit for modernizing our technology stack. He had already hired 3 junior developers, who looked like they were barely old enough to rent a car, and he wanted me to train them to press the buttons I had spent a decade designing. I looked at him, noting his perfectly styled hair and the expensive watch that probably cost more than my first apartment. He thought he was putting the old horse out to pasture. He had absolutely no idea he was talking to the man who owned the pasture itself. "I understand," I said, giving him a slow nod. "You want a complete technical documentation of the intellectual property and a transfer of all administrative credentials." "Exactly." Julian beamed, clearly thinking I was rolling over without a fight. "I love a cooperative team player, Roger. I knew you would understand the corporate direction we are taking." "I will need a few weeks to organize the system files," I lied. "There is a vast amount of historical context and custom logic that needs to be cataloged. We have 8 years of version histories and server configurations that are not easily explained in a single document." "Take your time," he said, already looking down at his phone to check his calendar. "Just make sure the new engineering leads have full root access to the main servers by Friday afternoon. We want to start the migration process over the weekend when database traffic is relatively low." I walked out of his glass office and, for the first time in several years, I felt completely alive. It was the distinct feeling you get when you are playing a high-stakes game of cards, and you look down to see a winning hand while the arrogant player across the table just pushed all his chips into the center. I went back to my desk and started documenting, but I was not writing helpful tutorials for his new team. I was conducting a thorough legal audit. I pulled the server logs for the past 8 years. I downloaded the complete repository commit histories. I documented every single instance where Bradley, Julian, or the previous managers had claimed my code was proprietary company technology in official emails to potential investors and clients. I built a comprehensive digital dossier. Then I went to the secure filing cabinet in the basement once more. I checked the dates. The annual lease renewal was due on the 1st of October. It was currently the 15th of October. The company had missed the renewal deadline. They had also failed to pay the $1 annual lease fee. According to the strict terms of the contract Bradley had signed, the lease had officially terminated. NetVantage Incorporated was currently operating its entire business on stolen intellectual property. I did not say a word to anyone. I just kept typing at my keyboard, smiling politely at the junior developers who looked at me with pity. They thought I was being phased out. I was actually waiting for the tide to rise so I could drown the leadership team. The beauty of corporate incompetence is that it always leaves a clear paper trail. Arrogant managers assume that because they have fancy titles, nobody will ever question their authority or check their work. Julian Kent was the perfect example of this rule. While I was supposedly writing documentation for legacy systems, I was actually deep diving into the company's private sales contracts. I still held administrative access to the entire network because nobody had bothered to revoke my credentials. To them, I was just part of the background. I eventually found a secure folder marked Project Vanguard. It was a contract with the largest retail conglomerate in North America. We were talking about a deal worth $200 million. The pilot program was scheduled to launch in exactly 3 weeks. I read through the technical specifications promised to the retail client. They were selling proprietary predictive behavioral modeling, real-time inventory management, and customized user intent algorithms. They were selling my code. They were not just using it internally. They were white-labeling it and selling it as a standalone product to a third party. I checked the intellectual property clauses in the client contract. NetVantage warranted that it possessed full and exclusive ownership of all underlying technology. That was a lie. It was a $200 million lie. If I pulled the license, NetVantage would not just lose the deal. They would be in immediate breach of contract for fraud, and the retail giant would sue them into bankruptcy. They had promised to deploy the predictive neural network to 50 stores in the first phase, and they had guaranteed that the software was fully proprietary. I needed to be absolutely sure of my footing. I spent the entire weekend running code comparisons between the source files I had written in my basement 8 years ago and the files currently running on the Project Vanguard test servers. It was a 98% match. They had not even bothered to refactor the variable names. I found comments I had written in the code back in 2015, including jokes about my dog and reminders to buy milk, still sitting in the deep logic of the neural network. They had not rewritten a single thing. Julian's new architecture was just a superficial user interface slapped on top of my engine. It was like putting a sports car body on a lawnmower engine and claiming you built a supercar from scratch. Then came the final nail in their coffin. On Wednesday afternoon, I was in the break room making a coffee when a junior developer named Peter Cross walked in. Peter was a smart kid, fresh out of a top engineering school, who still had hope in his eyes. He was one of the few developers who actually asked me technical questions instead of copying code from internet forums. He looked around nervously to ensure we were alone. He seemed worried that someone might see us talking. "Hey, Roger, can I ask you something confidential?" he whispered. "Go ahead, Peter," I said, stirring my coffee. In the all-hands engineering meeting this morning, Julian showed us the base logic for the new prediction module, Peter said, looking uncomfortable. He told the team he wrote the core logic himself during a weekend hackathon. But I looked at the repository history. The syntax and structures are identical to your old commits from years ago. My blood ran cold, and then it boiled. Julian was not just pushing me out of the company, he was plagiarizing my life's work in real time. He was claiming authorship to a room full of young developers who did not know any better. He was standing in front of a whiteboard, drawing boxes around my algorithms, and pretending he had conceived them over a single weekend. "Did he actually say he wrote it?" I asked, keeping my voice quiet and steady. "Yes," Peter nodded. "He said he refactored the clumsy legacy logic into a streamlined heuristic. But Roger, he literally just renamed the variables. He changed user velocity to customer journey speed and called it an original invention. He also took my comments about latency mitigation and renamed them to predictive flow acceleration. He did not even understand that the formula he called a heuristic was actually a stochastic gradient descent variant. I had customized specifically for our transaction volume. Clumsy legacy logic, I repeated. That logic was currently processing $3 million of transactions every single hour. It was the absolute foundation of the entire company, and he had the nerve to call it clumsy legacy logic. I just thought you should know, Peter said, grabbing a soda. It did not seem right to me. You built the foundation of this company, and he is acting like you are just a temporary employee. Thank you, Peter, I said. Keep your head down and do not mention this to anyone else. I will handle it. I contacted an old friend from graduate school named Clara Stone. Clara was a brilliant attorney who specialized in intellectual property litigation. We met at a quiet tavern far away from the technology district. I slid the thick folder of documents across the table. Tell me if I have a case, I said. Clara read through the original lease agreement, the missed payment notice, and the Project Vanguard contract. As she finished reading, she started to laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound that cut through the background noise of the tavern. Roger, she said, wiping her eyes. This is not a standard lawsuit. This is a complete corporate execution. You own the foundation of a tech unicorn and they simply forgot to pay the rent. They are using unlicensed software for a $200 million deal. What is the play? I asked. Silence, she replied. Let them dig the hole deeper. Let them launch the pilot program, take the investor money, and finalize the contracts. The more they rely on your intellectual property, the more leverage you will have. You need to officially record the copyright assignment in your name at the federal office under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, just to be safe, but keep it quiet. When the time comes, we do not send a polite warning. We send a legal bomb. If they claim ownership of this software during the Series D due diligence, they will be violating Securities and Exchange Commission, Rule 10b-5, which is a major federal crime. I returned to the office on Monday with a lighter step. Julian stopped by my desk later that afternoon. How is that legacy documentation coming along, Roger? We really need to look at removing your administrative credentials soon. It is almost complete, I said, offering a polite smile. I am just making sure every single line of code is properly attributed to the correct author. We would not want any confusion later. Great, he said, completely missing the double meaning. By the way, can you look at the latency on the Project Vanguard server? The performance is lagging. I would love to help, Julian, but that sounds like a task for your new engineering team, I replied. He scowled and walked away. The server was not lagging because of a hardware issue. I had throttled the processing power by exactly 5%. It was a minor adjustment, a small reminder to myself that the dog does not walk the master. The Series D funding round was set to open the following week. NetVantage was attempting to secure $50 million from major investment firms on Sand Hill Road. The investors required a strict disclosure of all intellectual property. If Bradley and Julian answered that the company owned all the code, they would be committing major securities fraud under federal laws, specifically violating Securities and Exchange Commission, Rule 10b-5. They would also be in clear breach of their fiduciary duties to the shareholders. I spent the rest of the week preparing my files. I removed every explanatory comment from the active server files. I obfuscated the variable names in the codebase. I turned the clean engine into an impenetrable black box. If they wanted to run the company without me, they would have to do it without knowing how the machine worked. The invite for the upcoming board meeting appeared on the shared calendar and then immediately disappeared. They had hidden the event. It was a strategic review to finalize the funding and draft my termination package. I did not wait for an invitation. As a founding shareholder, I had a statutory right to attend meetings regarding major corporate assets. I printed a formal notice of an intellectual property audit. I walked over to Bradley's assistant, Chloe Finch, a young woman who looked constantly stressed. Chloe, please add me to the agenda for the Tuesday board meeting, I said, handing her the document. She looked nervous. Oh, Roger, I think that meeting is for executives and board members only. This is a formal intellectual property compliance audit, I said. If I am not on the agenda, the investor due diligence will fail automatically because of outstanding legal queries. That word made her freeze. She did not understand the legal details, but she knew it sounded expensive. She added my name to the schedule. Bradley stormed over to my desk 10 minutes later, smelling of expensive cologne and anxiety. Roger, what is this? We are trying to close a major funding round. We do not need engineers cluttering up the boardroom. It is just a standard formality, Bradley, I said, not looking up from my screen. The investors need to clarify the status of the founding code. I will be there to confirm the technical details so you can get the check. He hesitated. His greed made him stupid. He assumed I was helping him secure the money. Fine, he snapped. 5 minutes. You confirm the technology is proprietary, and then you leave. I agreed. The stage was set. The board meeting was held in a massive room overlooking the river. Around the mahogany table sat the board of directors, Bradley Thorne, Julian Kent, 2 venture capital partners, and a corporate lawyer named Stuart Pierce. When I walked in, nobody stood up. Bradley gestured to a chair in the corner of the room. "This is Roger, our legacy engineer," Bradley announced. "He is just here to sign off on the intellectual property diligence." One of the venture capitalists looked at me. "So, you built the original system?" "I did," I said, remaining standing. I walked directly to the head of the table. "And the company owns all the code, correct?" the investor asked. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the room, "that is completely incorrect." The room went entirely silent. Bradley laughed nervously. "Roger, do not confuse these gentlemen with irrelevant details." "It is not an irrelevant detail, Bradley. It is an expired lease." I plugged my laptop into the display screen. The first slide showed the original intellectual property lease agreement from 8 years ago. The second slide showed the missed payments and the formal termination notice. "We have an assignment of inventions clause in your employment contract," Stuart Pierce, the company lawyer, said, suddenly looking alert. "This lease predates my employment contract," I replied. "The intellectual property was created before the company was even incorporated. It was explicitly excluded from the standard agreement and licensed back." "Check your files, Stuart. You simply did not read the documents." Stuart frantically searched his computer. His face turned red in a matter of seconds. He looked at Bradley. "Did you sign this?" "I sign hundreds of papers," Bradley stammered. "It does not matter. He works for us. It is our code." "I worked for you," I said, "but the lease expired on the 1st of October. You failed to renew it and failed to pay the fee. The license is terminated. Every transaction processed by NetVantage for the past 14 days has used unlicensed software." I clicked to the final slide, displaying the Project Vanguard unauthorized usage fees. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, you are committing active copyright infringement. If I contact the legal team at Project Vanguard, your $200 million contract evaporates before sunset. Bradley looked like he was going to faint. Julian looked terrified. The venture capitalists turned their cold eyes toward Bradley. They did not care about his excuses. They cared about their money. "What is your number?" the lead investor asked. "I do not want a job here, and I do not want a one-time settlement," I said. I slid a new licensing agreement across the table. This agreement creates a new entity, Miller Tech Systems, LLC. NetVantage will pay a licensing fee of 15% of all gross revenue derived from the predictive engine. The license is immediately revocable if you attempt to reverse engineer the code. "That is outrageous," Bradley shouted. "That destroys our profit margin." "Then write your own code," I replied. "Have Julian build a new engine. He is a genius developer, right? Give him a keyboard. I will shut down the servers now, and he can write a replacement before the client launch on Friday." I looked at Julian. He stared at the table, completely silent. He knew he could not write a basic program without help. "We cannot rebuild the system in time," Stuart Pierce whispered. "Then pay the rent," I said. It took them less than an hour to break. The investors forced Bradley to sign. They were not going to let a $200 million contract collapse to save a founder's pride. I packed my laptop and walked out of the building. I did not take a cardboard box of personal belongings. I only took my hard drive. By the time I reached my car, the restructuring had already begun. Julian Kent was fired immediately for gross incompetence. Bradley Thorne was stripped of all operational authority, remaining only as a powerless figurehead. 3 months later, I am sitting in my quiet home office. NetVantage closed its funding round, but its valuation was cut in half because of the massive licensing fee on its books. Every time they process a transaction, my company receives a percentage of the revenue. They do the work, and I receive the rewards. I ran into Peter Cross last week. He told me the engineers are terrified touching the codebase. They treat my system like a holy temple. If anything breaks, they do not dare touch it. They call my consulting firm, and I charge them $500 an hour to resolve the issue. People often say you should never burn bridges. That is poor advice. Sometimes you must burn the bridge to show the people on the other side that they were only standing there because you built it. I took my licensing check to the bank yesterday. The teller looked at the amount and asked what I did for a living. I am in real estate, I told her with a smile. I rent out logic to people who do not have any.